Now that we've looked at our station's format, it's time to start getting into what demographics are. Here we have a child. What do you think he's watching? You're likely able to guess. Probably kid programming. Now, how come you don't see ads for Bud Light, Jared's Jewelry, or Law and Order during these shows? How come accident and injury commercials usually play during the daytime and you don't see them at night anymore? How come they're usually playing during judge shows? How many secret deodorant ads have you seen during NFL football games, if you were to watch them? How come people like to go to the movies early to watch the previews, but they often have movie commercials play on their TVs and they don't pay any attention to them? I know part of it is that the preview programming is more advanced, it gives a little more depth, but there's also a factor of demographics. If you go to the movie for a comedy, usually they offer some comedy shows that might interest you in the previews. Usually the comedy audience doesn't see many horror previews. Action audience sees a lot of action previews. In radio, it's the same way. If you listen to a hip-hop station, you likely won't hear ads for boots and hats. There may be some country hip-hop listeners, but those two usually don't mix, and each has its separate station. If you have a country style and you're a hip-hop station listener, you listen for the music and then you go to the rodeo for fun. Also, you wouldn't hear about ladies' night clubbing on a Christian station. Why is that? Jack FM is a radio station that claims to play what we want. But they can't just play anything. They can't play a death metal song right next to a country song, right next to rock and roll. Why can't a station play some of everything? There are some people a lot of people actually, who say they like a little of everything, but even you yourself, think of what you do with your Pandora app. Do you want to just mix it all up and listen to a country song next to an oldie song, next to a hip-hop song? Or would you really like to just listen to all your country stations right now while you're in the mood, later move on to your hip-hop pop stations, that kind of thing? Segmenting. That's what radio stations do for their listeners. They find what most listeners have in common and put them all in one spot. Kind of like the grocery store. You won't find basketballs next to the bread. You won't find flour next to the milk, even though people might still like those at the same time. Same with stores. They don't mix men's, boys', women's, children's clothing all in one spot, making you have to dig through it. Instead, they present it in different spots in the store and hope you'll visit those. Another example of what you wouldn't find is a wrestling audience seeing an Extreme Makeover Home Edition ad. Maybe somebody who watches wrestling also likes Extreme Makeover, but it's likely when they're in the mood for wrestling, they aren't in the mood for the sappy show. They may be in the mood for Monster Energy, though. This is target audience, knowing who's likely watching and trying to give them more of the same type of thing. Here we have three very different people. And not to say that they have nothing in common, everybody has something in common, but what are the chances that the guy in the Beauty and the Beast shirt is going to be very interested in Lil Wayne that the guy in all the black is talking about? Not very likely, possible. If it's a big controversial issue, maybe, but if it's just Lil Wayne's latest album, the guy might pretend to be interested, but he'll be trying to think of other things in his head and his mind will be trailing off after a while. We don't want that to happen on our radio station. It's every marketer, advertiser, broadcaster, journalist's job to know the audience because we don't want to lose their interest. One happy client equals more happy clients, and so we want to keep our current listeners happy and give them stuff that they want to pay attention to. If we do lose their interest, what happens to us? Well, of course, we lose our advertisers because advertisers don't want to pay for ads, which nobody will watch. And then we also lose our jobs because there's no point in a radio station or media that nobody's paying attention to. We could do it freelance if we want, but we won't get paid for it. These are a set of categories that demographics are often defined by: age, education, income, gender, marriage status, whether they have kids, their race, their location, employment. And you can adjust programming to meet people based on these things. For instance, you wouldn't want to play a serious law show to a 12-year-old. You wouldn't need to advertise for college degree programs to a guy with his doctorate. And high-income people may be interested in the Lexus, but low-income people would not. Maybe you would want to advertise McDonald's to them, where the higher income people are too fancy for McDonald's. They want their Red Lobster or whatever they eat. Male and female the same way, like with the sports. You don't want to advertise, you could possibly advertise jewelry around Valentine's Day during a sports broadcast, but for the most part, men aren't going to get all excited about jewelry. 54% married. Marriage has another effect. For instance, you don't want to have a whole bunch of dating websites if most of your listeners are married. And if they have kids is another factor. You have to worry about if their kids happen to be watching or listening. You need to have some kid-friendly programming, but aimed at those adults. Then location. For us, we are heard worldwide, but listeners understand that we're mostly local. So when we report traffic, our listeners in Des Moines, Iowa aren't interested in hearing about the traffic in Des Moines. They're listening for our programs and our music. Our listeners in this area, though, likely are listening for traffic. So we need to be sure to serve our listeners who can hear us locally with the traffic in their area, and serve our Iowa listeners with whatever else might interest them. That concludes our current discussion on demographics. I hope you gained some knowledge from this. Next class, we'll get into how you write or think differently for each target, and then focus on who KEOM's demographics are.